All right, hello everyone. This is Megan Giesiger from ALA's Public Programs Office. Welcome to today's webinar, Hybrid, a new take on post-pandemic programming. Next slide, please. Today's webinar is presented by ALA's Public Programs Office with funding provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan Humanities Organizations Grant. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this webinar do not necessarily represent those of the NEH or ALA. Next slide, please. A couple of notes about our virtual classroom. Only the presenter has microphone access during the presentation. We will be disabling the chat during the presentation and reopening it during the Q&A discussion. Please save your questions and comments for the end. If you have any technical issues, please use the Q&A window to communicate with ALA staff. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Laura Saunders is a professor and interim director at Simmons University School of Library and Information Science. Her teaching and research focus on the areas of information literacy, including mis- and disinformation, reference services, and academic libraries. She also teaches a course on intellectual freedom and censorship. Laura has a PhD and a Master of Library and Information Science, both from Simmons College, and a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Boston University. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Laura.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you to ALA for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So as Megan mentioned, this webinar is called Hybrid, a new take on post-pandemic programming. And this is actually the first in a series of webinars. So what we're going to do today is really kind of frame the topic and start to introduce some of the concepts related to hybrid programming and some of the decision making that would go along with choosing to do hybrid programming. And this will really set up the rest of the series. So I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about how we got to this space where we're considering hybrid programming. And I realize that we're probably all pretty aware of the background. But just as a reminder that the COVID-19 pandemic forced a lot of libraries across the country to close. But even as we were closing our physical buildings, most of us were trying to find ways to ensure that we could continue to provide services, including programming to our patrons. And so across the country, public and academic libraries pivoted to online programming. And so these are just a few examples of the many types of online programming that our libraries were providing during the year and more of the pandemic. A lot of libraries were running story times for young children, and others were also running book groups that were more geared towards adults. There were a lot of lectures that included topics of all different kinds, but also including author talks. And a lot of libraries were also running more educational or instructional kinds of classes. And these ranged from everything from cooking classes to different kinds of crafts. And here again, libraries got creative, where in many cases would create take and make kits so that patrons who needed access to materials for the crafts could go and pick them up curbside at the library. There were lots of self-care classes, which was and continues to be very important, and classes on healthy aging. And again, these are just some examples of the different kinds of programming that we were doing, even while our doors were closed. And I would say that we learned a lot from doing online programming. One of the most important things we learned, I'm sure, is about the technology that we need both to run and to access this kind of programming. So this means both we as library staff and our patrons had to learn a lot about technology. We had to learn about the tools that we need to present and access this kind of programming. So many of us were using Zoom, perhaps for the first time. A lot of us were learning how to use other kinds of streaming programs. And we were also getting different introductions to social media and things like that. And in some cases, this involves some training. I think Librarians, because we are used to using technology, in a lot of cases, we were able to get up to speed relatively quickly. But again, in some cases, we were using tools that we really just weren't familiar with. But for our patrons, in a lot of cases, this was a really new area for a lot of them. As we started presenting programs online, we also had to get used to new and different presentation styles. So this is even the way that I'm presenting here today, where I can't see people's faces. I can't get that feedback that I would normally get in a live face-to-face presentation. That is different. It's something new that we have to learn how to gauge that crowd and present in a way that's going to continue to be engaging. So engagement is another area that we had to think about. How can we make sure that our attendees are going to be engaged and perhaps even have a chance to interact with us in these new formats? And then I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to just mention that copyright was an area that came up quite a bit during the pandemic, as we had to be concerned about the various ways in which we were sharing and accessing information. So not surprisingly, as we got more used to virtual programming, we realized that there were pros and cons to presenting online, just as there are pros and cons to presenting in person. Some of the pros of virtual programming include being able to reach new and wider audiences. In a lot of cases, we were attracting new people to library programs, people who had never attended in person for various reasons, whether they were faced with mobility issues that might have prevented them from coming to the library in person, whether our hours were not feasible for them, but we were able to reach people that we hadn't reached before. Virtual programming also in a lot of cases gave us access to a larger pool of speakers because the speakers didn't necessarily have to be on site. We could have people from all around the nation and even around the world joining us virtually and connecting with our patrons. We didn't have to worry about room capacity issues. There was no need to cap our programs, so that was nice. It also just gave us a chance to be a little bit creative in terms of topics and delivery. And in some cases, the virtual program may have been cost effective. I put that with the question mark because it really depends. It depends on whether we were had to get new access to new technology and things like that. But in some cases, we may not have been running into the same kinds of costs that we would have in person in terms of doing things like maybe providing refreshments, covering travel for speakers and things like that. But of course, there are also drawbacks or cons to virtual programming. One of the biggest ones, of course, is the access to technology. This is true for us as librarians, of course, but it was perhaps especially true for our patrons, that in some cases, they didn't have access to the hardware, the software, the devices that they may have needed in order to join us for virtual programs. Or even if they had the hardware and software, they didn't always have the technical literacy that they needed. If I think about some of the people in my life, including my mother, for instance, it took her a while to really get used to things like Zoom. So there was a learning curve there. There were also challenges that came along with the technology, dealing with glitches and Zoom bombing. Luckily, there wasn't, I don't think, too much of that, but I did see some of it, and it could present a challenge. And then finally, it was just our overall comfort with the virtual format, both for us as library staff, perhaps for our speakers, and for our patrons. Some of us may have felt very comfortable being online, presenting that way, interacting that way. For others of us, it was not necessarily our preference. So now we're in the next stage. I'm certainly not going to say the post-pandemic stage, but we're in the next part of the pandemic, I suppose. And what does that mean? Well, it means that in a lot of cases, we're seeing libraries reopening. Many of our libraries are open. And what that means is that we are starting to relaunch, in a lot of cases, our face-to-face programming, but we're also recognizing that we're facing varying levels of comfort, both for our staff and for our patrons. People have different vaccination statuses, whether they're vaccinated, fully vaccinated, partly vaccinated. People have different reactions to masking policies, and some people are going to be more or less comfortable if the people around them are unmasked. And then we have to continue to be vigilant and to respond to surges and variants in the virus. So in some cases, we may find ourselves hopefully not having to close our doors completely again, having back on. And as we talk about comfort levels, of course, we have to recognize that there are going to be some patrons and staff whose to the risk factors. And if we have people who are immunocompromised or have other additional risk factors, they may find in-person programming to be especially uncomfortable. So we need to be aware of all of those things. And that can lead us to the idea of hybrid programming. So first of all, what exactly do we mean by hybrid programming? Hybrid describes classes or events that are run in person and are live streamed so that patrons can choose to attend the event in either format. And in addition, with hybrid programming, we can also often choose to record the event and make it available to people asynchronously afterwards. But the main point is that it is available in both formats live, so both in person and live streamed. So why might we even consider doing hybrid events? Let's just consider some of the benefits. One of the first is that it does accommodate different patron abilities and preferences. So again, if we have people in our community, which we inevitably will, who either can't get to the library in person, again, because of mobility or other kinds of access issues, distance, transportation issues, and so on, hybrid programming will give them a different option for attending events. And likewise, if we have people who are simply less comfortable coming in person because of the different reasons that we just discussed, again, hybrid would give them that opportunity to still participate, but to do it from the comfort of their own home. I had mentioned earlier that virtual programming often allows us to avoid attendance caps. Aside from perhaps having some sort of limit to the number of people that we can have on a Zoom platform, for the most part, we can really open our programming up. And hybrid, once again, gives us that option. We can have people both in person up to the maximum, and then we can also open the event up to people online. One of the nice things about planning a hybrid event is that it gives us flexibility in the event of a change. Hopefully, we're not going to be facing a lot of those changes, but if we do face another closure, or if we just have a surge in cases in our community and we decide that we want to switch the event to be totally online, if it's already been planned as hybrid, we're going to have all of the technology already in place, so that switch can be very easy. So if we're thinking about hybrid programming, there are a few considerations that we're going to have to keep in mind. The most important is technology requirements. Now, because many of us did pivot to that online programming, we may feel that we've got a lot of the technology in place, but hybrid programming can require some slightly different or additional technologies than what we had for straightforward virtual programming. So future webinars are going to get into this in a little bit more depth, but just think about the fact that if we are both live streaming and having face-to-face attendees, then we may need more than one computer. So for instance, the speaker may need a computer to see their slides, while at the same time we may need another computer, or at least a web camera to show the speaker and the venue to the people who are joining online. We're going to need microphones so that the people online are able to hear and participate, and so on. So we have to think about technology requirements and other logistics. Do we have a space that is suitable for hybrid programming? A space that gives us, enough room for the in-person attendees and enough quiet to allow the people online to be able to join and hear. We might also want to think about if we need additional support staff to do things like monitor the technology, keep track of the chat and things like that. It's also really important to think about how we make sure that the people joining remotely have an equitable experience to those joining in person. So we need to think about things like if there's going to be any kind of interactivity, if there's going to be discussions, if there's going to be hands-on activities and things like that. Is there a way to ensure that the people who are joining us remotely are going to be able to participate as well? We just want to make sure that everybody who attends is able to engage. And so we may have to think about some of the activities that we're running and how they translate to online. And so that brings us to the question of which programs really are suitable for hybrid. And again, we have future webinars that are going to give some specific examples of this, but we just want to think about the fact that, for instance, an author talk, which is mostly going to be somebody, a single speaker speaking out to the audience without a lot of interactivity, might work extremely well for hybrid programming, whereas a makerspace event where there's a lot of hands-on work with the tools may be less suitable. So we just want to think about that. And then finally, we want to consider the comfort level of our speakers and instructors. It's not to say that people won't do hybrid or can't do hybrid, but some people might need a little bit more support. So I want to just wrap it up by reminding all of us that hybrid offers us, I think, a lot of opportunities. It really does expand our reach in our community and hopefully gives our patrons more access and more choice in terms of how they engage with us. But we just want to remember that it does need to be used judiciously. So if we're going to consider hybrid programming, we really want to think through exactly what it's going to take to do this right. What technology are we going to need? What kinds of programming are we going to run? We're even going to want to think a little bit about how we're going to promote that programming, because we may not need to reach out to different parts of our community in different ways. So we need to think about all of the planning that is going to go into that and just make sure that we've got the resources, both technology resources, but also the staff, the human and time resources in place. So again, all of this is really just a framing for the future webinars that are going to take a much deeper dive into these topics and look at how we really think about the decision-making for choosing hybrid programming, including what kinds of programs might be most suitable, what kinds of technology we need, and then looking at some specific examples of libraries that have run hybrid programming and what their experiences were and what they learned from it. So at this point, I think we'd like to open it up for questions and perhaps some discussion. And I just had a couple of questions that I wanted to share here that might get us started. Although please feel free to ask your own questions or take the discussion in any direction you want. But I'll quickly read these questions to get us started. So I'd be interested to hear what excites you about hybrid programming and what concerns you might have. And if any of you have already had experience with hybrid programming, either as the sort of planner, presenter, or as an attendee, it would be great to hear a little bit about your experience. So I'm going to stop for a minute there and see if we've got any questions ready.